The whale came back. That's what stunned them most. Not the first impact, not the moment tons of blubber and rage slammed into the side of their ship like a battering ram. Not the sound of splintering wood or the geyser of seawater that surged up over the deck. Number it was what happened next, because the whale didn't retreat. It circled. It watched. And then it came again, this time faster, harder, head first. The Essex was a whaling ship, and the men on board had seen whales thrash, dive, even fight back after being harpooned. But they'd never seen one attack unprovoked. Not like this. The second collision struck the ship dead on, lifting the bow from the water before crushing it under its own weight. The great beast vanished beneath the waves, leaving chaos in its wake. And in that instant, the men understood something they never imagined when they left Nantucket nearly 2 years earlier. They were not the hunters anymore. They were the prey. The whale ship Essex was not a large vessel, just under 90 feet long, built for utility, not luxury. She had weathered many voyages before, sailing from the whaling capital of Nantucket into the deep oceans of the world. Her mission, like so many others, was to hunt sperm whales and return home with barrels of valuable oil. In August of 1819, she set out once again under the command of a young captain, George Pollard, Jr., just 29 years old. His first mate, Owen Chase, was more experienced at sea but equally untested in leadership. Alongside them were 18 other men, sailors, green hands, and shipkeepers, most of them Nantucketers, others from Massachusetts, and a few from as far away as the West Indies. They expected to be gone for 2 or 3 years. That was typical. Whaling voyages were long and punishing, but also potentially lucrative. A ship that returned full of oil could make each man aboard a fortune. They sailed down the Atlantic, around Cape Horn, and into the endless blue of the Pacific. For months they hunted in vain. The oceans were nearly empty. Other ships had fished the local waters dry. The men grew restless, their morale thinning like the lines they cast into the sea. Then came whispers from passing ships. A new whaling ground, far west, far off course, and dangerously remote. Desperate, the Essex changed course. She headed for the so-called offshore ground, more than 1,000 miles west of the Galapagos. It was here, on November 20th, 1820, that their fate found them. It started like any other hunt. A pod of sperm whales appeared in the distance. The men leapt into action, launching 3 smaller whaleboats and giving chase. The chase was long and tiring, but familiar. Each whaleboat was manned by 5 or 6 men, including an officer and harpooner. Meanwhile, Captain Pollard remained aboard the Essex, keeping watch from the deck. Then something strange. Owen Chase, in one of the whaleboats, noticed a massive sperm whale behaving oddly, separated from the pod, thrashing near the surface. It was enormous, over 80 feet long, larger than the Essex itself. Before anyone could react, the whale surged forward, not toward the boats, but toward the mothership. Chase watched in horror as the whale smashed into the side of the Essex. The ship groaned, tilted, and held. Then the whale disappeared, only to return moments later, swimming fast and low. This time, it struck head-on. Wood cracked like gunfire, beams split apart, water poured in. When the whaleboats returned to the Essex, they found a shattered hull and a crew scrambling to save what they could. The ship was finished. They had only minutes. The men scrambled to load supplies into the 3 small whaleboats. They managed to salvage a few bags of hardtack, some casks of fresh water, and navigational instruments. But it wasn't enough. The Essex slipped beneath the waves and left them alone on an empty sea. No lifeboats, no radio, no charts, just 20 men in 3 open boats, and the closest land was over 1,000 miles away. Captain Pollard wanted to head west toward the Marquesas Islands, only 1,200 miles away. But the men refused. They had heard tales, likely exaggerated, of cannibalism on those islands. Ironically, it would soon be their own story that redefined that word. Instead, they set their sights east, toward South America, 3,000 miles away. It was the longer, deadlier route, but it felt safer. They didn't yet understand the price they would pay for that fear. They were hardly a week out when things began to go wrong. A storm separated the boats briefly. One was nearly lost. Sails tore. Men began to go mad from thirst. The rationed food, barely enough to survive, ran out in less than a month. They tried to catch fish. They harvested rainwater from their sails. But the Pacific was merciless. The sun baked their skin. The salt opened their lips like paper cuts. Men began to hallucinate. Some refused to eat. Others refused to speak. After more than a month at sea, they spotted Henderson Island. At first, they thought they were saved, but the island was barren. No fruit, no fresh water. After a week, they knew they couldn't stay. 17 of the 20 men set out again. 3 remained behind. And that was the last anyone ever saw of the Essex as a crew. From this point forward, it was simply survival. One of the boats vanished in the night, never seen again. Historians believe it was lost to the sea. All aboard were presumed dead. The other 2 continued east, but their supplies were gone. Then came the first death. A young black sailor, Lawson Thomas, died of exposure. His body was buried at sea, solemnly, with prayer. But the next man who died wasn't buried. He was butchered. It was the beginning of a grim, unspoken pact. The men began to keep the bodies. They cut flesh into strips, dried it on the boat planks, and rationed it. When they were lucky, they ate the dead. When they weren't, they made decisions. In Captain Pollard's boat, there were 4 men left, barely alive. When one died, the others did what they had to do. Then the rest drew lots. Owen Coffin, Pollard's own 17-year-old cousin, drew the black spot. Pollard refused. He begged to take the boy's place, but Coffin stood firm. "It is my lot," he said, and laid his head down. A crewmate pulled the trigger. He was shot and eaten. When the boats were finally found, over 90 days after the Essex had sunk, only 8 men had survived. 2 boats. One found by a British ship, another by an American. The men inside were barely recognizable as human. Skin blackened by sun, eyes sunk, limbs wasted. They had drifted for thousands of miles. They had consumed the flesh of their friends. They had watched death, murder, and madness unfold in silence. But they had lived. Back in Nantucket, the story stunned the whaling community. At first, it was whispered, then published. Owen Chase's written account, released just a year later, detailed the horror, the whale attack, and the months of starvation. Herman Melville, years later, would draw inspiration from this account for Moby-Dick. But the real story was no myth. It was a matter of record. Captain George Pollard never went to sea again. His next ship wrecked on a coral reef, and he took it as a sign. He spent the rest of his life in quiet obscurity, serving as Nantucket's night watchman. When Melville visited him years later, he found an old man hollowed out by memory. "I'd rather die 1,000 deaths," Pollard said, "than again pass through the horrors of that ordeal." The 3 men left behind on Henderson Island were rescued months later, miraculously alive. Of the original crew of 20, only 8 returned, and of those, not one would ever forget the moment when the sea rose up, turned against them, and left them alone with their hunger. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.